on page 57. Hume's skepticism should we be skeptical about it? I know we've already read this, but we're going to have to read it. Perhaps more than any other person, David Hume is responsible for the skepticism prevalent today. As an empiricist, one who believes knowledge can only come from sense experience, from empirical method. Hume believed that all meaningful ideas were either true by definition, which I explained to you yesterday, or must be based on sense experience. Since according to Hume, there are no sense experiences for concepts beyond the physical, any metaphysical claims, those about concepts beyond the physical, including God, should not be believed because they are meaningless. In fact, Hume asserted that propositions can be meaningful only if they meet one of the following two conditions. The truth claim is abstract reasoning, such as mathematical equation or a definition, as in 2 plus 2 equals 4 and all triangles have 3 sides, or the truth claim can be verified empirically, scientifically, through one or more of the 5 senses. While he claimed to be a skeptic, Hume certainly wasn't skeptical about these two conditions. He was absolutely convinced he had the truth. In fact, he concludes his inquiry concerning human understanding with this emphatic assertion: if we take in our hand any volume, any book of divinity, which is religion, or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry, which is reasoning, and illusion. You see the implications of Hume's two conditions. If he's correct, then any book talking about God is well use all religious writings for kindling as a fire starter. Nearly 200 years later, Hume's two conditions were converted into the principle of empirical verifiability by 20th century philosopher A.J. Ayer. The principle of empirical verifiability claims a proposition can be meaningful only if it's true by definition or if it's empirically verifiable. By the mid-1960s, this view had become the rage in university philosophy departments across the country, including the University of Detroit, where I, Norm, was a student. In fact, I took an entire class on logical positivism, which was another name for the brand of philosophy espoused by Ayer. The professor of that class was a logical positivist. Was a strange breed. Though he claimed to be a Catholic, he refused to believe it was meaningful to speak about the existence of a reality beyond the physical. In other words, metaphysics, God, things like that. In other words, he was an admitted atheist who told us that he wanted to convert the entire class to his brand of semantical, just in words, atheism. I once asked him, how can you be both Catholic and an atheist? Ignoring 2 millennia of official Catholic teaching, he replied, you don't have to believe in God to be a Catholic. You just have to keep the rules. On the first day of that class, this professor gave the class a task of giving a presentation based on chapters in Ayer's book, Logic, Truth, and Language. I volunteered to do the chapter titled The Principle of Empirical Verifiability. Now keep in mind, this principle was the very foundation of logical positivism, and thus the entire course. At the beginning of the next class, the professor said, Mr. Geisler, we'll hear from you first. Keep it to no more than 20 minutes so we have ample time for discussion. Well, since I was using the lightning fast roadrunner tactic, I had absolutely no trouble with the time constraints. I stood up and simply said, the principle of empirical verifiability states that there are only 2 kinds of meaningful propositions. 1, those that are true by definition, and 2, those that are empirically verifiable. Since the principle of empirical verifiability itself is neither true by definition nor empirically verifiable, it cannot be meaningful. That was it, and I sat down. There was a stunned silence in the room. Most of the students could see the coyote dangling in midair. They recognized that the principle of empirical verifiability could not be meaningful based on its own standard. It self-destructed in midair. In just the second class period, the foundation of the entire class had been destroyed. What was the professor going to talk about for the next 14 weeks? I'll tell you what he was going to talk about. Instead of admitting that his class and his entire philosophical outlook was self-defeating and thus false, the professor suppressed that truth, hemmed and hawed, and then went on to suspect that I was behind everything that went wrong for him the rest of the semester. His allegiance to the principle of empirical verifiability, despite its obvious fatal flaw, was clearly a matter of the will, not of the mind. There's a lot more to Hume, particularly his anti-miracle arguments, which we'll address when we get to chapter 8. But for now, the point is this. Hume's hard empiricism, and that of his devotee, A.J. Ayer, is self-defeating. The claim that something can only be meaningful if it's empirically verifiable or true by definition excludes itself, because that statement is neither empirically verifiable nor true by definition. In other words, Hume and Ayer try to prove too much because their method of discovering meaningful propositions excludes too much. Certainly, claims that are empirically verifiable or true by definition are meaningful. However, such claims don't comprise all meaningful statements that Hume and Ayer contend. So instead of committing all books about God to the flames, as Hume suggests, you may want to consider using Hume's books to get your fire. Okay, so let's turn in your little atheist book. And we talked about the emboldened questions yesterday, and we did numbers 1 and 2, right? So we're on number 3 of the equip.
We're on number 1 of the
Oh, we didn't even get to that? Oh, well, why don't we start there? Sounds like a good idea. So what 3 things did Dr. Sayer's Socratic approach reveal to the students? You can look at your book. That was a while ago.
Any teaching is worth trusting only if it points to the truth.
Yeah, any teaching is worth trusting only if it points to the truth. Nobody wants to believe a lie, right? So any teaching is worth trusting only if it points to the truth. And another one?
Apathy about truth can be dangerous.
Apathy about truth can be dangerous. Yeah, that's kind of along the lines of the first one, or the second one.
My truth, one must be ready to give up those subjective preferences in favor of objective facts.
Yeah, so in order to find truth, one must be willing to give up unsupportable presuppositions in order to find. the professor wasn't willing to give up those unsupportable presuppositions. And then the other one that I would add is that many popular beliefs are not supported by the truth. And we'll go through some. But one of them would be, and I remember being in a church my cousin took me to. Church, I use the term. It certainly wasn't a Christian. And the woman who of the church was very well known, and this was in San Diego. And one of the first things she said in her talk was, just as all roads lead to Rome, all roads lead to God. And actually, all roads don't lead to Rome. I live on a cul-de-sac. Doesn't lead to Rome. But all roads can't lead to God, right? Because different beliefs are contradictory. So you can't have two contradictory things both be true. So people have to be willing to give up those unsupportable beliefs in order to find. Then why is it illogical? By the way, nobody here must have a brand new book because they took Robbie's life. I guess. I'm glad they did. Anyway, so why is it illogical to affirm that Western logic is different than Eastern logic? Yes.
Because like living in a different world doesn't change what is right and what isn't right.
That's true, but I'm looking for a more answer based more on logic. Yeah.
Prove Eastern logic, you have to use Western.
Right. In order to prove Eastern logic, you have to use Western logic. Remember, the Western logic was either or, and the Eastern logic was both. Now, there are times when both and can be a correct statement, right? But not in terms of competing claims. The both and doesn't work with the competing claims. Yes.
Why is like one of those Western logic?
Because Western thinking and Eastern thinking are pretty significantly different, and there is this sort of I don't want this to sound like a negative term, but fuzzier way of seeing things. In the East, by East I mean Asia, India, places like that. And in the West, we tend to be very Greek in our thinking, very logical. And it isn't the thinking that's wrong. It's this idea that you can take two claims that are opposite one another and say it's a both and. That it's not an indictment of all of these. Okay, so that's a good question. So why should we be skeptical of David Hume's skepticism?
Yes. Because he has a non-stop belief in something, and he should be skeptical of it. Like he trusts it without a shadow of a doubt, even though his own skepticism says
That's true, and it's a good point. I don't know that it gets to the heart of why we should be skeptical, why we should be skeptical. But But it's a good point, it's a valid point. Anybody have anything else, you know?
His whole philosophy he had two claims. That something is true by definition and something is empirical and reliable, and the two things that you can trust. But in and of itself, those two claims we don't meet either of these two.
Right. His entire philosophy is self-defeating because his point that he's making is self-defeating. So Hume tries to prove too much because his method of discovering meaningful propositions excludes too much. It doesn't allow for anything beyond the empirically verifiable and that which is true. And yet we all know things that don't fit those things. And that very statement, the very statement of the only meaningful propositions are those that are true by definition or by empirical verifiability, is itself not true by definition and not empirically verifiable. So therefore, it's by his own definition, his argument is meaningless. But from someone who doesn't agree with Hume's standpoint, it's and you will have a question on a test asking to explain that. 10 minutes
Ish.
ish,
About 13.
but it's also
Deal.
Can I?